Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, colleagues. We're going to wait a little bit longer just to see as more colleagues and participants join us. And then we'll get started in 1 minute. So hang in there. All right, good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you're calling in from, and welcome to this panel conversation on working where it's hardest, where we're going to talk about frontline security, some duty of care issues, and remote operations in real high risk and frontline environments. My name is Bridget. I'm a senior security officer at UNHCR, and I'll be moderating today's conversation with this wonderful group of panelists that we have here. Just to start by saying some of our colleagues are actually joining us from the field, so they may at times lose connectivity, so bear with us, but it's all part of the experience. We're here during HNPW, Humanitarian Networks and Partnerships Week, to gather, reflect, discuss, and partner to find solutions to some of the challenges that we collectively face. So today's session, working where it's hardest, we're talking about different contexts. It might be hard to reach areas with poor connectivity, minimal infrastructure. It might be on country borders or frontline conflict zones, where, as we know, most recently, threat and risk is changing on an hourly basis. Sometimes we're also going to discuss less visible hardship, so maybe prolonged isolation or the psychological impact of working in high-risk duty stations, and the security and programmatic decisions that we have to make under pressure with imperfect information far from headquarters. I think it's also important to frame this conversation within the current humanitarian context. The sector is facing increasing shrinking humanitarian space, politicization of aid, budget cuts, UN reform, shrinking donor budgets, and the humanitarian reset. These aren't abstract pressures, but they're pressures that are being felt in the most front line of operations, and our conversation today is guided by that as well. We hope that today you'll leave with not polished answers, but at least genuine ones. Practical insight from people who have actually had to make hard decisions or advise decision makers on taking decisions on the ground under pressure when there are real stakes at play. I'm joined by a panel of experts. Thank you so much for joining us. The colleagues are joining us from across the UN and also NGO community, and they'll bring direct field experience to the conversation today. We've also allocated some time for Q&A, so please do use the chat function to add in your questions, as we will have time to answer these today. I think firstly, let's start the conversation by going to Alan. Alan is the head of global security for Chokra. Welcome, Alan. And Alan, I have a question for you regarding what these environments actually look like. So can you tell us a little bit about what the conditions look like for staff working in them? What is the day-to-day pressures that sometimes headquarters or donors rarely see about frontline environments?
Yeah, so when we talk about remote or high-risk operations, from my perspective, the first thing to get across is that the environment is very fluid, as we've seen over the last number of days, and it can be very hard for us or a HQ to keep up. So we rely on our staff on the ground. We rely on our partners. In some of the areas we operate, where Troker operates as an example, it can take us up to 5 days to get to a project site. And that assumes that the roads are open, the checkpoints are passable, and that fuel is available for the cars. For a vast majority of conflicts or regional kind of insecurity issues that we face, there is very little clear front lines, and the onus on us managing security is higher. So it's harder for us to see what is safe and accessible by modern standards. because the controls in these areas shift daily. For national staff and partners, it's also really important for us to remember that this isn't a temporary deployment, it's home. They live here, they live in those environments, and the pressures aren't specific to conflict. Yes, there may be shelling, there might be an airstrike, there might be IEDs or armed clashes in some contexts, but we also have fuel shortages. We also have cash liquidity issues, which means sometimes their salaries can't be drawn down. We have banking restrictions, border closures that stop medical supplies. We have food shortages. And the thing that scares me the most is the communication blackouts that can be long. These pressures accumulate. So the day-to-day, what does it actually look like for those frontline staff? Well, it looks like the program manager recalculating every day whether something is worth the risk, whether his project or whether his trip that week is actually worth the risk. It looks like staff negotiating passage or access at very ad hoc and dangerous checkpoints. It looks like trying to deliver assistance to areas and also worrying about what's going on with your family a few kilometers behind you. And from a headquarters and a donor perspective, a lot of that is invisible. We definitely read the reports. We look at those perfect risk ratings and risk scores, and we see the incident summaries. We visit when security teams tell us it's safe to do so. But what we always don't see is the sustained cognitive load on staff, that constant trade-off being made locally between their impact that they can have, the access that they have, and their personal safety. There's a huge amount of pressure to deliver on NGO staff at the minute, and it's all driven as well in the background by the aura of staff cuts. But yeah.
Thank you, Alan. And I think this is really important to understand. From the UN perspective, Paul, I'm wondering if there's anything you'd like to share in terms of, what is the day-to-day looking like for UN staff in some of these high-risk environments, and what are the conditions and day-to-day issues that they're facing that we're not seeing a lot here at headquarters? Paul, I think you might be on mute.
Thank you, Bridget. Following on from Alan, much the same, and I completely concur with his comments, particularly regarding our national staff that are working with us, and especially with regards to Afghanistan. We have to remember that this is their home. They have their families with them, and that in itself is a challenge for ourselves, for security professionals, because we always have to bear this in mind when we're implementing security procedures, that of course they are with the UN, the family are classed as dependents, and so we have a responsibility towards them as well as to our staff. And I'll bring it into context with what's been happening in Afghanistan this last few days, since last Thursday, with attacks, drone attacks, and very unpredictable situation at the moment in Afghanistan. The attacks have been daily, and we don't know where the next ones are coming from. So of course the compounds, we have bunkers. We can provide the security for our staff there. Not much of a challenge because we drill these bunker procedures on a weekly basis. But for our national staff, of course, they're not on the compounds. They're working from home at the moment, and so they don't know where this is coming from. And one of the biggest challenges for me now is the communication challenge, making sure that staff, not just the international staff on the compounds, but the national staff across the cities, are actually aware of what's happening, and keeping them informed. And then I will move on to something else that Alan mentioned regarding communication. We had a communications blackout, an intentional one, but it was all phone lines, all internet, everything went down for 3 days. And 20 years ago, when I was first into this game, that wouldn't have affected us too much. We'd have jumped over to our UHF, VHF, and things would have been fine. But it was a real problem because the UN is so dependent now on the internet. And so we did have some fallback options, and we were able to get things going again, but it did cause a lot of panic. So communications now is critical, and going back to where I started, getting information to our staff is one of the biggest challenges that we face.
And super important in high-risk environments to communicate and to dispel rumors and ensure that staff feel they're supported and feel they're in contact. So I can understand how that is disconcerting for many people, including security colleagues. Just to also say, obviously, Paul is calling us as the security specialist for Afghanistan for UN Women. So welcome, Paul Regan, to the conversation.
And
I'd
Bridget,
like to, yeah, sorry.
Sorry, Bridget, just before you move on, I just want to apologise in advance because I'm hotspotting on a mobile phone at the moment because we actually no internet. So sorry.
As I said in the beginning of the conversation today, I think that's the reality of the operating context in which we are. So I think it speaks volumes that you're here today, and thank you to yourself and other colleagues. Zaman, I'm hoping to talk to you now. Zaman is the Regional Security Stress Counsellor, not Security Counsellor, although security does need support often. From UNDSS, thank you, Zaman, for joining us. From a psychological and mental health support perspective, what does that landscape look like for staff in hardship and remote contexts? What resources exist? What is realistically accessible when connectivity is limited, as Paul and Alan have already talked about? And what are the gaps that we need to be honest with staff about?
Well, thank you very much, Bridget. Can you confirm if you can hear me well, even though I'm in New York, but there's always connectivity issues. Thank you very much, Bridget, and thank you for having me today in this important panel. I'm going to speak from the perspective of the UN and what is the availability of the social support and services in the UN. So in terms of availability, we do have the traditional staff and the stress counselor available in some locations, not all locations, but some locations. And these are the in-house counselors that staff members can reach out. We do also have the regional stress and staff counselors. Different agencies have them where they can provide also support remotely when needed. So staff can also reach out to those resources within their organization or also to us at the UNDSS. In select locations, we also have a network of external mental health providers. These are local professionals who work in those locations, and we have identified them. We have spoken with them, reviewed their credentials, and basically put them through the vetting process, and we believe that they can provide quality mental health services. So we do have the availability of external mental health professionals in some of the locations. And pretty much all the UN organizations have gone through some peer support or peer helper programs. So those individuals within the United Nations agency funds and programs who have been trained, they are also available to provide support to their staff members. And some agencies recently have, provided some outsourced counseling support and made that available for their staff members through different organizations such as the Rome Institute. So these are in terms of the what is available. And your second part of the question was talking about the limited connectivity issues. When the connectivity is not there, what can we do realistically? Short-term counselor deployment, it is rare, but it happens. Whenever the fund is available, we can always just deploy a counselor on the ground for a short-term period to make sure that the staff feel supported and that we provide the psychosocial support and services that are needed for the staff members on the ground. So that is one option that is realistically available. And when we have connectivity issues, as I said, we do rely more strongly on the peer helpers on the ground and also the external mental health providers that we have identified in those locations. And staff members can always reach out to us to make sure that we have the updated list so they have it at their disposal should the need arise. And also, as Paul was talking about, the remote counseling services gets really, really problematic when we do not have connectivity. But sometimes we rely on direct phone calls and text messaging. Oftentimes, the internet gets blocked or filtered, or certain applications are not possible to connect in different locations. So that's why direct phone calls and text messaging is something that we do. In terms of the gaps, we certainly do have a shortage of a specialist. When I talk about specialists, I talk about staff and stress counselors, the in-house stress and staff counselors, which is important to ensure that we provide the support that the staff members need. And also the other shortage or the other gap is the culturally sensitive psychosocial support services. It is important that the psychosocial support that we provide meet these international standards, but at the same time, it has to be culturally sensitive as well, right? If the interventions are not scientifically valid, then they will not be effective. And it's the same thing. If the interventions that provide are not culturally sensitive, then they will not be accepted. Even if we offer them, they will not be accepted by the staff members. So we do have a shortage of local counselors, in-house counselors who speak the same language, who are from the same culture, who can actually connect with the staff members, at a personal level. We do have a shortage of local mental health providers in some locations due to war, economic hardship, like Yemen, in Gaza, in Afghanistan. These locations, due to years of war, we have this shortage of, basically local mental health providers. And the fragmented support is another gap that we do see in the UN. And that's mainly due to the lack of in-house counselors in many locations. And that's why the support that we provide, psychosocial support that we provide, are incident-based rather than some kind of a more regular psychosocial support services. And the last point that I would just want to make, and I wrap up, is the stigma and career fear. Despite increasing all these open conversations on mental health, we have the UN mental health strategy and all of these conversations that are happening across the agencies. Many field staff still fear that admitting to mental health issues may negatively affect their careers and future deployments. So that gap is also there. So that stigma is something that we have to conquer and deal with, let's say. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you, Zaman. I think it's important. I do want to talk about the unique risks that organizations face based on their mandate. So, Paul, if I could go back to you, each of our organizations here have different mandates, and the mandate themselves may generate specific or unique risks. What might be security to risk to one organization won't necessarily be a security risk to another organization because of the nature of the mandate. How do you manage the challenge between what you're mandated to deliver and the unique risk exposure that mandate might create in a context?
Yes, Bridget, thank you. Indeed, of course, I perhaps don't have to explain too much that UN Women's mandate in Afghanistan is a challenge. And of course, I think everyone would understand why. The UN Security Cell, we sit bi-weekly, and of course, all the agency funds and programs sit around the table and discuss the prevailing threats and risks. But as you rightly point out, each agency has a different mandate and also a different risk appetite. Of course, WFP, UNICEF, they have to put themselves out there and to deliver their mandate. UN Women's mandate, of course, we can perhaps be a little bit more risk averse because our isn't life-saving or necessarily critical. of course, it's important. And so we can consider our risks and perhaps look out for future risks in a far easier way than our colleagues in WFP, UNICEF, etc. That doesn't mean that we will not take risk. And of course, UN Women delivering in Afghanistan each and every day, our staff, of course, are under a certain level of risk. And so we have to adapt, and each agency has to look at its own risks and consider them, analyze them, and put in place control measures that may differ. So what I will do for a road mission for our staff going visiting partners would be often completely different to what colleagues in UNDP, for example, would do. However, we all work under the same, as we know, we all work under the UN SMS framework. And it's whether you use that as a baseline or you increase it. UN Women will always use the UN SMS as the baseline for its security. We would never go below those measures, but quite often, as I mentioned, we are not risk averse, but we can afford to increase the measures that we implement to ensure the safety and security of our staff whilst delivering our mandate.
Thank you, Alan. And I think this is an important conversation. And G, I'm interested to hear your perspective on the importance of program in security and vice versa, and how we work together. Just for colleagues to know, G is the International Health and Safety and Security Manager for Flora and Fauna International. Welcome, G. So what are your thoughts in terms of, in high-risk environments, how important is it to embed security in program?
Hi, thank you. In high-risk environments, security, in my opinion, cannot sit beside programs, but it needs to sit within it. Siloed SRM functions really work effectively from what I've seen when security and programs teams operate separately. Objectives can be misaligned and at times unintentionally counterproductive. Program teams focus on delivery. Security teams can sometimes focus on risk reduction. And without integration, they can sometimes undermine each other. The most successful environments that I've worked in were where SRM was engaged in the design phase of programming. So understanding the program's objectives, delivery models, timelines, constraints before the implementation began. That early engagement allowed SRM to become an enabling factor rather than a restrictive factor. So in terms of embedding SRM for me and into that design phase was not about dictating how the project was run. It was more about raising questions and risks or concerns, asking constructive solution-based questions, supporting scenario planning, factoring security requirements into the design and into the budgeting, essentially. When this happens, organizations avoid the sort of costly retrofitting solutions later that often happen when things aren't thought through at the programmatic level. Security can become dynamic and adaptive, and it's seen as an enabler rather than a barrier. But interestingly, the way I break it down through my experience has been in terms of assets. I break it down into 3 core pillars. And I know I'm oversimplifying this a little bit, but one is medical, one is logistics, and one is communications. And interestingly, I think some of the speakers have spoken about some of this already. Having the right equipment across these 3 pillars is essential, but the real impact comes when these needs are identified at that planning and budgetary phase. However, equipment alone is not enough. If teams are not trained or use the kit, and if emergency responses are not rehearsed, then even the best resources have limited value. Again, risk assessments and procedures are great, but they're only meaningful if they inform the training design. They align with the kit that's available on site. They reflect the program realities, and they form part of that broader capacity building within the program of work. Embedding SRM means integrating kit, procedures, and training directly into program delivery. When done well, program staff actually start to become your SRM champions rather than passive recipients of rules. In my experience as well, trying to integrate programmatic tech into SRM has also been really useful. I currently work in a conservation organization, and interestingly, there's several organizations that are using their tracking systems for wildlife monitoring, but they're also using it for tracking ranges and vehicle movements as well. So enhancing both program effectiveness and staff safety at the same time, but using ultimately programmatic kit to do both jobs. The challenge, of course, about embedding is capacity. Embedding SRM deeply across multiple projects running simultaneously across the world can be quite resource intensive, especially when SRM staffing is limited. But even incremental integration, starting at the design and planning phase, can make measurable difference.
Gee, it's very interesting. I think it lends well to Paul's points as well on, how does mandate create risk and vice versa in terms of program? How can we actually prevent through design and be part of the design process in terms of program? I want to turn to Ramon Liers from UNICEF Regional Security Advisor. Welcome, Ramon. Colleagues, before I ask Ramon the question, I would like to remind everybody that you can put your Q&A, your questions for the panel in the chat. Please put them in the Q&A. We're monitoring that. We'll get to that shortly. So Ramon, what does rigorous security risk management or assessments look like when access is remote and information is imperfect?
Well, thank you for that question, Bridget. There are a couple of questions in that question, right? So allow me to briefly decompose. I think the primary reason for more rigor when access is remote and information is imperfect is very simple. When access is limited, the margin for error becomes smaller. Rigorous security risk management for me doesn't mean having perfect information or predicting the future, right? Also in remote settings, we need to be cognizant of the fact that risk is an organizational construct. It's not something that suddenly exists out there, right? And for us in the UN security management system, it's defined by how likelihood and impact are assessed. Now, what does it mean for us, right? We are explicit about what we know. We are honest about what we don't know, but we're also very clear about the level of risk our decision makers or leaders consciously accept based on what we term program criticality, or what are the benefits of us to deliver this programmatic activity in these areas. So the decisions are deliberate. I would say they're accountable and they're not accidental. Lastly, and I think this is also a point as discussed earlier today during one of your sessions, and I think the person-centered approach. And this is important because I think SRM, security risk management, at its core is about people and enabling them to deliver programs, including in remote areas, within what we call acceptable levels of risk. So rigorous within the UN context also means understanding the different types of staff profiles and identity-related vulnerabilities to ensure more effective risk management approaches that also builds trust with staff, right? It helps us avoid a one-size-fits-all approach and contributes to rigor. Now, what does rigor for us mean in practice? I would say it starts from working with facts, not with impressions. It builds a clear picture of verified information, triangulated, such as incidents, I would say access constraints, movement patterns, and, for example, communication limits. Then we break the problem down into parts, right? Decomposition. We consider what could happen, how exposed we are, and how serious the impact would be. We are explicit about time, right? Our assessments are time-bound, ranging from a few hours till max 12 months. And we assess risk for this defined period and review regularly, especially in volatile environments. And then lastly, on this aspect, we need to avoid what was earlier mentioned, reverse engineering conclusion, and let an analysis inform decisions and not the other way around. So how do we build our assessment process that is analytical rather than assumption-based? A simple discipline helps us here, right? We clearly separate facts, assumption, and judgments. So we actively check for human bias, especially the tendency to start normalizing danger or assume that past calm predicts future safety. So our overall objective is not precision, but relative clarity, understanding which risks matter and most and where uncertainty is greatest. And then to wrap up my part on this question, now how do you communicate uncertainty honestly to decision makers, right? So say clearly what is known and what is not known. Use confidence levels rather than false certainty. I would say present real choices with their implication rather than single recommendations. And lastly, link decisions clearly to accountability. That's why in the UN security management system, based on hard lessons learned, like the Canal Hotel bombing in Iraq, we have a framework of accountabilities. And leaders or our decision makers are asked to consciously either accept, control, avoid, or transfer risk based on the best available analysis. Back to you, Bridget.
Thank you, Ramon. And I think this is interesting. We've covered both programmatic impact and how program also might drive risk. We've talked about how we look at likelihood and impact and structured decision making and how we advise a security decision maker. I'd like to also talk to Osman. Osman, I'm hoping you can hear us. Osman is joining us from Sudan. He's our Senior Field Security Officer in Sudan for UNHCR. Osman, I'm interested to hear your perspective on modalities of operation. So cross-border or cross-line, cross-front lines operations carry a distinct risk profile. It's not just the profile of the individual staff, as Ramon mentioned, and the program, which Paul talked about, but also how we're operating, whether it's cross-line or cross-border, particularly if authorities on one or both sides constrain coordination. Right. So what does managing security and information sharing look like in a cross-border or cross-line context?
I don't know if I'm audible. Thank you so much, Bridget. Unfortunately, because of bandwidth, my video will be on and off. So if you allow me, first and foremost, I mean, from especially in the region where we operate, is a region where conflict almost always rotate around sovereignty. So having that overarching understanding itself will give you now, whether you are moving cross-line or you are moving cross-border, we don't treat any of the movement as logistical, issue, because it is always at the intersection of sovereignty, perception, and human survival. Because at one point, there's one side which is mostly, let's say, for instance, are recognized globally, and the other side is not. And these are maybe sometimes their ability to wage a kinetic war with each other is almost equal. So in some cases where we have got a clearly drawn, front line, sometimes one of the parties may not agree cross-line operation. So you may have to do everything cross-border, let's say from a third party. And whichever way you go, from what our experience has been is that we have to be very honest in what we are facing. We must first accept that the information is always partial. Whatever information you get from this side or the other side is partial. So there's nothing like it's a fact. There is that anything you do in terms of accessing must always be negotiated. It is subject to negotiation. It's not also at the national or subnational level. Sometimes you have to negotiate at the village level because not all these parties have got a very well clear command and control among their troops. They are almost like a franchise affiliated with each other rather than one full command and control. So And at always, when you deal with these parties, you know that the intent will not always be declared. They will tell you something, but the intent is hidden. What you see is the situation that is presented to you. But what we normally say, in the absence of formal coordination, it does not mean risk does not exist. So in this case, there is multiplicity of uncertainty that we face throughout when we are doing either cross-border or cross-line. So from this particular perspective, what we have realized is that security management shifts from coordination dependent to analysis driven. So you must you have to literally philosophize that you always say that situational awareness and early warning should be the vanguard of everything you do. And then it boils down what now security analysts or security officers make out of it to present managers with a well thought out security recommendation upon which informed decision is quickly made. But decision making itself is not the ultimate thing. Are you rapidly able to implement this security decision? But for you to do it, what do you have in place? If you don't have, the, let's say, ability to lift staff members and all that, and this is what we are facing across where we are operating now. So on all these things, then what we ask ourselves is that, so what does security management look like under these conditions? So one of the things is that we should be able to have a disciplined risk framing. In other words, it's not about like the way we do in security risk management, where everything is event-based. If you get your event descriptor right and you apply all the things that you're supposed to apply, then you come up with, a particular, let's say, risk threshold. It's not. We realize that when you're working in this environment, it is more of exposure based. How much are you exposed at any one time to the risk itself, depending on what's happening. So it is not about where the fighting is happening today, but rather what is the control mechanism ahead of you? Has the front line shifted? So in this case, what we realize that the key thing that we normally look at where security officers map actors, we are saying this actor is in control, this actor is in control of this place. So it is not a static thing, it is fluid. It should be seen as fluid actor control in terms of the control may shift from morning. You might have been given the travel authorization by a party that's in control of a location A. But by the time you approach that location A, they are not in control of that location. So you have to negotiate with the people who are in that location. So at any one time, your ability to map the actors on the ground should remain fluid. And in terms of information sharing, we look at it from the perspective that information is layered at any one time. There are no formal channels. So you have to at all time try to triangulate information. You might receive something from national staff. You might have a local interlocutor somewhere. You might have a humanitarian partner from somewhere saying something. But all this information, unless you tie up and have something to triangulate, whether you have a group of 5 people that you discuss with, or you have got, let's say, a third party that has a bird's eye view of the thing. So at any one time, the security information is kind of layered. But in terms of now, when you have this information, what do you do with it in terms of security information sharing? And this is where information can either become a weapon against you or can become a security for you. So in this case, we normally call a calibration of the transparency of the way you share this information. Because if you don't have to constrain the information sharing, but you cannot share all the information such that the sharing itself now puts staff members at risk, because it can be used, that information can be used, especially where kidnapping and ransom is very, very prevalent. The less information available, the better. So this is where the need to know aspect of information sharing comes into play. The other aspect is in terms of discipline. Who needs to know what kind of information? Some information can be available to all staff members, but others can only be available to decision makers. So that ability of the people who are overseeing either cross-border or cross-line to be able to segment and segregate information in such a way that to know which one is meant for which layer is very critical. One thing that we have also witnessed that works is the decentralized decision making. In areas where communication is not very much reliable, where we, especially let's say where I work, where communication is not completely reliable. So in this case, and a vast country where people work from different sides, you must, despite our, let's say, UNSMS or the UN Security Management System having an architecture the way it works, but one key thing that we have learned and we now propagate is decentralized decision. You put like a caveat and limitation to the managers, but give them the window to operate, such that in case when there's a complete communication breakdown, managers or people who are on mission in a particular level should not become paralyzed because they have always been told what to do, where to go, where to sit. So in this case, every mission that is going, although the information remain controlled, but they have got that ability to have the leadership to make a decision as quickly as possible, because that is what saves lives. One of the things that we also look at is perception management. In cross-border or cross-line, how we are seen matters more than what we normally do. And this goes back to triangle of, where we talk about acceptance. Sometimes you may not get complete acceptance, but what are people perceive about what you do? So there's an element of transparency. So what you say and what you do. For instance, we had a case where we were to take a particular route from point A to point B, but somebody diverted between point A and point B from that particular designated route and for a good reason to another. And that created a suspicion that held up operation for almost about 4 months. So in other words, the element of transparency in the way we are perceived must always be cultivated. So I will stop there unless there's any other question. But what I can say is that cross-border and cross-line operation will always carry elevated risks. But with structured analysis, principled information management, and disciplined leadership, where at the same time you have an element of decentralized performance of tasks, will always be very helpful. So in a constrained coordination environment like this, discipline clarity is the difference between reactive exposure and controlled risk that will help us operate across this very kind fluid environment. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Osman. And I think this conversation on decentralized decision-making is important to ask G in relation to preparedness of colleagues, whether it's decision makers or managers or staff themselves. What have you implemented in the past that's worked in terms of preparedness for colleagues?
Yeah, one of the things that I think is really effective is scenario planning, especially with the programs teams. It's one of the most practical tools for embedding SRM into programs. The purpose is that it makes risk tangible and understandable for non-risk specialists by walking the teams through realistic scenarios, grounding them in actual delivery models, operating contexts. You create a shared understanding of what realistically could happen, what actions would be required, what resources would be needed, how long responses might take, where the capability gaps exist. This often reframes the conversation actually around risk appetite and prevention measures rather than response. Scenario planning only works though when SRM understands the program objectives, the operating model, and it must be specific. Generic scenarios do not really build capability. Increasingly though, interestingly, there's a lot of talk about conflict areas but what I'm seeing more of is the request to have these kind of scenarios based around climate-related scenarios. So hurricanes, flooding, landslides, wildfires, especially for those staff that are in remote areas where immediate assistance isn't there. And it's becoming more of a prominent issue than the traditional conflict-based threats in some contexts. One of my biggest operational concerns and I'm sure people will echo this on this session, but it's when people are working in remote areas and they get moderate injuries that can become life-threatening due to delayed response times. So, again, running medical and evacuation scenarios linked directly with program tasks, including the mechanism of injury that's most likely, allows organizations to refine medical training and equipment requirements. Scenario planning for me, it also reinforces communication and tracking needs, medical competencies, evacuation feasibility, decision-making thresholds, which Osman was talking about, decentralizing it. Most importantly, it ties training to the actual resources available as well. The training that you'll end up setting up through this will reflect the kit that the teams have, not the kit that the teams wish they had. When done properly, in my opinion, scenario planning draws program teams into SRM solutions. It's a lot more collaborative, practical, and empowering. It also helps sort of tease out those issues where there is a perceived threat, where there may not be an actual threat with some teams. But ultimately, again, it's about pushing program teams to become those SRM champions again and open their eyes to the kind of risks that they face, especially when you do get this fatigue element where staff can either fall into the boiling frog syndrome, where they slowly get used to the risk and don't see it as risk, or they get hypersensitized to it and then they can't function.
No, absolutely. And I think we'll probably come back to this conversation with Zaman shortly. I want to kind of focus the next batch of questions and the last batch of questions before we go to Q&A on partners and working with partners. So colleagues, please add your question into the Q&A. We've got some great questions coming in and we'll get to those shortly. Paul, I wanted to understand, most of the delivery in some inaccessible environments happens through partners or through local partners. How do you structure risk sharing with partners that actually supports frontline partner staff rather than simply transferring or passing the risk to another organization?
Yeah, we have a vast array of partners across Afghanistan, mainly women-led organizations. And so there starts the risk. We work with the SLT, the Saving Lives Together, through DSS, and I ensure that our partners are all involved in anything that SLT arranges. But going beyond that, I try to work closely with, if there is a security element within the partner, I'll work closely with them. But I will also, if that doesn't exist, I will provide them information. But it's a fine line, Bridget, because you need to be careful that you're not accepting the onus of responsibility for them, because of course we don't have that compliance and the framework of accountability that was mentioned earlier with them. But we will always advise, and one thing I wanted to mention, going back to the earlier question, security mainstreaming for me is critical, and so I ensure all our program teams consider security at the outset of the planning of any program or project that they're doing. And by doing this, we can involve the partner earlier. I can look at the security, what security measures that the partner has, what security risks particular ones they may face. But that's, if we do the security mainstreaming and involve security at the outset of the planning, that saves us having to play catch up halfway down the program when we realize that there's a security risk that has been identified by the partner, and we haven't been involved yet. So I find that, and I've got, I do have to repeat the message with our project managers, but I find that now, yes, security is involved right at the outset, And so we know which partners we're working with. And one thing I don't try and do is to teach them security, because these partners, they know security better than I do actually in Afghanistan. That they are dealing with the threats and the risks day in, day out. And I would never try and teach them, but I will direct them. What info I'll share with them information that I can share with them, and hopefully, or not hopefully, we are so far having success with our partners in that we're keeping them safe, and of course our own staff as well.
That's an important point, Paul, in terms of local partners and how much they can actually teach us. They were there long before us, and they will remain long after we leave. I think this brings me to another question for G on NGO versus UN risk management and security approaches, and how necessary is it to align these, and are they aligned or are they different? Do we have different approaches, the UN versus NGOs, in these high risk environments?
I think alignment between the UN and NGOs is complex and often imperfect. Many contexts there are gaps. UN agencies in some cases may not have visibility of all NGOs operating in the area. NGOs on their side may not understand how to effectively engage with UN and the coordination structures. Risk thresholds differ due to resourcing disparities as well. UN systems may appear rigid and hierarchical to NGOs. NGOs may appear more flexible and have a much higher risk appetite from a UN perspective. So these perceptions can sometimes create friction, I think. There are also structural issues. I think UN coordination mechanisms often prioritize INGOs, and sometimes unintentionally exclude national NGOs or local partners, despite the critical role that they play as national actors to provide delivery. So I guess what's necessary, how could it work better, I guess? Clear in-country contact structures that are accessible. In my experience, human engagement was always beneficial compared to just purely procedural coordination or data bombs of information. Define decision-making focal points. So again, goes back to that decentralized decision-making element, but on a coordination level. Honest discussions about risk appetites and operational realities between organizations would be really helpful, I think. Better inclusion of national NGOs, and clear expectation management regarding what support can and cannot be provided within the NGO community and by the UN agencies. I think sometimes a perception gap, NGOs may expect support from UN agencies that they are not mandated or resourced to provide. I think UN agencies may view NGO engagement as an additional burden on occasion, particularly in remote areas where there is a lack of stakeholders to work with. A more functional model would involve clearer support mechanisms rather than siloed coordination structures, I think. Again, about embedding as much as we can. That would require structural change, though. But, in my experience, SRM professionals collaborate more than any other element within NGOs. Across NGOs, SRM professionals frequently share information and assist one another in ways that other departments don't. Peer-level collaboration platforms like GISF are really strong examples of how it can work in practice really well. At its core, SRM is about preservation of life, assets, organizational reputation, and program objectives. That shared purpose does create a natural alignment, even when institutions differ. So it's about trying to iron out how those institutional differences are blocking us collaborating in a better way.
Yeah, and I think in terms of joint visions and joint purpose, our role is saving lives. So Alan, Paul mentioned it earlier in terms of saving lives together framework. But Alan, I'm interested to hear your thoughts on this. Where does SLT, saving lives together, actually add value on the ground? Or where does it need to add more value? Beyond being a coordination mechanism on paper, what does it actually deliver for on NGOs in high risk contexts, and where does it fall short for our partners?
Yeah, so I'm lucky that I sit at a global level, so I get kind of dragged into a lot of the conversations in completely different contexts. But there's definitely two things that stand out to me, and they've already been mentioned here. You know, when we talk about information sharing, that's something that most INGOs and local NGOs don't have that that same reach that the UN does, and it's that information share at a local level is really beneficial. You know, the understanding those verified patterns, those movement restrictions, anything that's emerging kind of regionally, and building that collective picture. It also allows all the NGOs or INGOs to calibrate their risks, so that no one is operating in isolation, and that we can all kind of move in a similar direction. The second kind of main benefit I feel for the SLT is security infrastructure. And Raymond mentioned it earlier on with the, you know, you have very, very different or specific kind of baselines in place when it comes to UN SMS systems. And for us, understanding those baselines is key, because when our local staff or when our teams on the ground in proximity to UN locations are really switched on, they really understand security and they understand the benefits, they can engage directly with UN teams on the ground, and they can a lot of times share and get access. And a simple example from our side is we were dealing with a very difficult situation where we were really asking ourselves whether we should stay. And throwing money at the problem wasn't necessarily going to fix it all, nor were we able to afford it. But a simple MOU with a UN agency in very close proximity to us allowed us to focus the funds we had on security at the remaining locations, which meant from our side, it brought the risk back down to appetite. So there are definitely some really clear kind of examples and clear kind of measures that you can use SLT for. There are, as G mentioned, lots of small little failings and small little pinch points along the way. And it is unfortunately hugely dependent on who you're dealing with at the local level or in country. If that team from the UN side is strong, well then, and your team is strong, the cooperation will be strong. And it is essentially that it's a security cooperation framework with zero funding. And there are going to be gaps between UN realities and the realities of NGOs. Yeah, that's kind of my take on it.
I think it's certainly personality dependent in some contexts and also leadership dependent, right? I think all sides need to understand the value of collaboration and cooperation. I am keen to turn to Q&A. So colleagues, please keep putting your Q&A in the chat. I've got one question here for Ramon on budget pressure. So we're under significant budget pressure, UN reform, humanitarian reset, shrinking envelopes from donors. What is the operational consequences of this for security and duty of care?
Thanks, Bridget. Well, firstly, my experience has taught me that budget pressure affects security and duty of care most sharply in remote and high-risk environments where flexibility already is limited. So cuts tend to erode the buffers that keep people safe, right? So let's say training, communication, redundancy, like our emergency communication system, our medical and evacuation capacity, but also rest and recuperation or rotation, and psychosocial support. But at the same time, I think also budget pressure also raises some fair questions, right? Such as Can we reduce on the UNSMS bureaucracy? Are we effective and efficient? Do we need to strengthen, for example, results-based management in security? But also, can we do less with less, right? So to answer your question more specifically in terms of what are some of the operational consequences, I think I can break that down in three things. One, I think risk can become less managed, not less real, right? So threats remain, but the ability to assess, to prevent, to mitigate, in other words, to manage and respond, in other words, security risk management weakens. The second part, I would say, besides the fact that risk can become less managed, risk tends to shift downwards, meaning individuals and small teams will absorb risks that should be consciously owned by leadership. And third, and that relates to what was previously discussed about the SLT in part, is that exposure shifts outward, right? So some of the operational consequences of budget cuts or pressure is that exposure tends to shift outwards, meaning reduced international presence reshapes exposure for our locally recruited personnel and partners, creating duty of care and ethical challenge. As just was mentioned, you know, the saving lives together doesn't just become more important, it also becomes more harder to implement as well. So to be clear here, as I explained earlier, right, risk is an organizational construction. Therefore, risk, even with budget cuts, is not transferred to partners in the SRM sense. That would be unethical. But we transfer an activity. Therefore, a potential operational consequence for me is not that risk is transferred, but that decisions that are made upstream reshape risks downstream. Without always, I should say, being visible, resourced, or negotiated. And it has ethical limits, because within the UN system, we often summarize this with a mantra, right? We all know this in UN security. There are no programs without security, and no security without sufficient and sustainable funding. But when safeguards erode to the point that risk can no longer be properly assessed or managed, continued operation also becomes an ethical question, not just a resource decision. Therefore, budget pressure does not remove risk. I think it tends to remove our safeguards. Back to you, Bridget.
Thank you, Ramon. And I think we have a great question also in the chat. I saw Alan responded to some of this question, but I do want to open it up to the panel. In highly remote or high-risk contexts such as Sudan, where international organizations increasingly rely on local partners to implement humanitarian programs through remote management or cross-border operations, how can organizations ensure that security risk management and duty of care are shared rather than transferred to local actors? More specifically, what practical mechanisms can be put in place, and turning to colleagues to see if they've got any examples of good practice, maybe SLT and other things, to ensure that local partners have equal access to training, resources, decision-making, incident management support, so that we do not end up with a system where risk is localized, but the responsibility and control remains international. Any thoughts from the panel?
Yeah, I'll chuck a couple of bits in here. My personal opinion is that if you've got partners working on the ground and they are front-facing the risk, the best thing you can do as a sort of more strategic partner is to capacity build. They are the experts, but sometimes having the mechanisms, understanding the processes and being able to teach those is really useful on two fronts, really. One, to make them look more attractive to donors themselves, so they can do all the risk management stuff, so they don't always have to come through big strategic partners. But the other element is to actually just help professionalize where we can and actually get some of that knowledge that's within those partners down on paper in some way, shape or form to evidence it. And I have heard arguments in the past working in humanitarian organizations where, well, what will happen is we'll capacity build them and then they'll leave and they'll go to the UN. And then we're back to square one. And my argument is, Well, saturate the market, train everyone, train as many people. The UN can't hire everyone. Train as many people as you can, and sooner or later we'll have really good SRM people in our local partners. That's all from me. I'm sure someone else has got more valid points than me.
Thanks, G. And certainly, I don't think the UN can hire everybody, especially in this budget crisis. So I think your saturate the market response is a good one. Osman, I'm wondering if you. Sorry, go ahead.
Yes. From I mean, this is not a kind of system wide, but from our organizational perspective, we, given the what we are dealing with and the situation, we started at the framework of programming itself. So the agreement between, let's say, for instance, UNHCR and the partners, there's an inbuilt component in the agreement itself. First, in terms of financing, there should be a percentage to help them at least be able to do something in terms of security. Because if you are transferring an activity, this activity will be taken on by people. So there must be a kind of financing component added into it. That aside, for instance, for me as the head of security, what we have done is that we do the SLT within the UNDSS framework, but at the same time, as organization, we have also the SLT. We kind of domicile it within our own selves. For instance, for every organization that UNHCR engages, I deal with the country level at my level. And at the sub office, where they work, they are also embedded at that particular point. For instance, if there's meeting between a program person and person from a particular, let's say, partner, that meeting normally the first 15 minutes is given to the security person to do the security briefing. If it is a collective partner meeting, the same. And in terms of our information sharing, we make sure that there's no information that is passed to our staff members that are not, again, coined and also provided to our partners. If there's a UN decision making, which is extra, let's say, which is like it's not domiciled within the UNHCR, but it is done as a UN-wide, we pass what is supposed to be passed in terms of information sharing ourselves, not within the UNSMS SLT, but as an organization, because for instance, as you know, within our security policy for UNHCR, it is captured what we do with partners. So this must be implemented, not only the UN-wide kind of SLT, but it is not the UN that is having a partner. It's an individual organization with a mandate. But by giving the activity to a partner, you are transferring part of your mandate. So that aspect is what we build in where we work, and to make sure that the issue of information sharing is not part of the larger burden that is normally forgotten. It's not anyone's responsibility. So we made sure that from the representation level all the way to the field unit, deep in the field, whichever partner has a UNHCR partnership is also the responsibility, either if there's a security person or in the absence of a security person, the head of that particular place. We have done a framework, a kind of standard operating framework that we have put as a guideline in place to make sure the aspect, because in some operation like where I am, information passage is not a luxury. It's a matter of life and death. And in fact, the timing of that information passage is key. And we realize that it is not only that we are benefiting the partners, we are benefiting ourselves, because sometimes because of our risk appetite kind of categorization, we normally tend to leave a little bit earlier than them. So our asset is normally deposited with them when we leave, when we go across the border. So that information passage and building that kind of partnership where people know that when you know, I know. But there are some cases where they are in deep field and we have no issue and we have no, let's say, ability to get the information. So more often than not in the deep field, we get more information from our partners than we give it to them. But so long that you create that environment that exists, that when they know that what you have, they get, you also get what they have, and through that ecosystem, you create a more, how can I put it, an ecosystem where there's a dependency between the parties, rather than one side loading onto the other. Over to you.
No, thanks, Osman. I think it's really important to give an example of SLT in real life from your operation. I have a question here on counselling services. So Zaman, I'm looking at you on this. Counselling services or formal counselling services won't be available everywhere. And so how does the broader organisation support staff mental health in high risk or hard contexts? And what can managers or HR or security or peers do? And what does a psychologically safe culture look like at the field level for colleagues to work in?
Well, thank you very much, Bridget. Beyond formal counseling services, I think the focus should be on systematic resilience building, where psychological safety is built into daily operations rather than a mere HR or only counseling function. I'll talk to the psychologically safe culture in a bit. But it is critical to have a coordinated and standardized system in hardship locations so that we can maximize the effectiveness of the scarce resources different organizations may have. In the UN system in general, this role is performed by the CISMS in the UNDSS, so we do have that leading role. On top of that, we have the mental health strategy across the UN system that was created to reinforce the accountability of all UN organizations and their senior leadership, and to provide support to the staff members dealing with mental health in all areas of, basically prevention, response, and support. Talking specifically on the roles of different, functions within the organization, talking about managers and HR, they are responsible to design and implement measures to reduce social risk and hazards in general. Like proactive workload management is another role that the HR can and managers can play. Focus on the reset and recharge. The periods of no meeting at all, so staff can actually calm down. No after hour or weekend emails. That's another thing that can be done. Supportive accountability is another thing. Monitoring capacity of people rather than their output only. Wellness check-ins and meetings. Providing a safe environment with multi-directional feedbacks is encouraged. And also normalizing mental health absences if people need to take some time off because of mental health reasons. When it comes to the roles of security colleagues, since security staff are the first to see a staff member's psychological condition, it is important to have security protocols that are trauma-informed, and the psychosocial support is integrated into the overall emergency management. Collaboration among security personnel with other, function, as well as the staff and stress counselors are of utmost importance in the overall management of the mental health services in the UN. An example I can give is that the collaboration that the security and the stress and staff counselors do during the HIM processes. Another measure could be the peer-led support. The buddy system is also something that is beyond formal counseling services. Peers are the most accessible resources in low connectivity zones, in the hardship duty stations. Your peers are the easiest accessible resources. They share the same vulnerabilities and struggles, so it gives everyone permission to be vulnerable together and to review their own struggles. And the last part of your question was on a psychologically safe culture. If I define psychologically safe culture, I can say mistakes. A psychologically safe culture is where mistakes are shared as lesson learned. Multi-directional feedbacks is encouraged. Boundaries are in place, and respect to off-grid time is in place. So if you're not working, that is respected. Communications are honest, even if they are sometimes uncomfortable, and that diversity and diverse perspectives are celebrated and are actively sought rather than be suppressed. So this is what I wanted to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Zaman. We have a great question in the chat on AI, and I thought I'd throw a curly one in from Dan here. Where and how could AI help security managers deployed in remote locations? Any thoughts? Any examples?
Well, I think I just tried to answer that. But look, I want to start off by saying that AI really needs to be treated with a little bit of professional caution, right? So I think it can really help us in structuring security briefings, structuring analysis. It can really help if you have to sift through lengthy documents. It can help you as an aid in brevity, which is an aid to clarity, but it shouldn't be used, in my view, in any theater as a substitute for your own cognitive abilities, right? It is, please only use it as a supportive element. So how can you use it? Again, it can analyze for you enormous amounts of data and highlight where are the key points that you should include in your own analysis. But as we say in any type of analytical database or format, garbage in, garbage out, right? So if you use it wisely. Over.
Thanks, Ramon, and I'm glad to hear we're not fully replaceable yet. Alan, did you want to come in on this? Did I miss?
No. So yeah, I suppose the times I've found AI most useful is when I am trying to spread information or specific, kind of reports across an org in a standardized fashion. And like that, I feed it the information I want it to analyze, and I make sure that, depending on the different sources it comes in and under, it will give it back in the same structured fashion. So every day, if I'm sending out the same report, then the information is in the correct locations, and it means I don't need to go and do that, like that admin work to make sure it's correct, because like Trocra has a security team of 3. So it, time is everything. The second kind of tranche or area that I've used it is around contingency planning. When you're building a crisis management exercise for anyone, you can ask AI to generate news feeds. You can ask it to generate all sorts of different content in different languages. You can tell it to give you fake staff profiles, missing information, and then when you throw that into like a specific folder that your crisis is going to work off of, all of a sudden your team is trying to translate stuff from languages they've never seen before, realizing that it's either relevant or irrelevant. And yeah, it simplifies so much. Yeah.
Work smarter, not harder, hey, Alan.
Exactly.
I'm conscious that there's one more question from our colleague in Senegal. Hello, Amadou. Nice that you're joining us online today. How can organizations uphold their duty of care to frontline personnel in high-risk environments whilst balancing operational imperatives, oversight, and the psychological impact of colleagues to facing insecurity on a regular basis? Any thoughts, panelists? How do we balance duty of care and security? It's the $1 million question, G.
It's really tricky, and it's a case-by-case basis, unfortunately. But I would say the better you understand the risks that they face and the context and how they need to deliver, the easier and more transparent the risks become, I guess, to deal with. And sometimes there are hard decisions to be made that actually, like, your geographic range needs to be reduced, or actually there's an element that is just not viable because of the current risks and how it's fluctuating. And it leads to hard discussions, I guess. But doing those things, like I was saying previously, like the scenario planning elements, like actually getting your program teams to actually start looking at the what ifs, how can that happen, how can we deal with it. It's quite interesting when they, in my experience, when they start pulling back a little bit and saying, okay, well, we need to start thinking about how we can really push these mitigation measures and make sure everyone understands them, because the idea of responding to this kind of calamity is just not worth it, and actually it's quite traumatic for everyone involved. But yeah, and I would try and push the same for local actors. Like my organization going through a drive of trying to capacity build local actors at the moment that we work with our local partners. And there's a wider group that are working on it, including, I think Alan's working on it as well. That where we are trying to look at the capacity building elements around it, how we can better help them and inform them, but also, the better informed local partners are, the more they can push back and say, well, actually, we need this kit and we need this to do this and we need this. And then it works out that actually we're budgeting effectively and we're resourcing effectively. We're not just transferring risk and hoping everything's going to be okay because they're just naturally experts, which is often a shield for not doing anything for some people, I think.
Zaman?
Yeah, thank you very much. I think, it's all about priority. I think earlier, please excuse my terrible short memory, either Ramon or Paul talked about it. They talk about the fact that when the budget constraints happen, normally security and social support gets affected. I think it's all about prioritizing duty of care to the frontline personnel and not continuously asking to do more with less, right? We have to look at the literature, looking at the fact that there have been so many studies out there in terms of the return of investment, ROI, when it comes to mental health, for example. It's currently at $4 per $1 that you spend. So reduction in absenteeism, reduction in wasting a lot of the time and energy that the staff spend at the front line. So they will become more effective, produce better, and eventually it's going to be a big benefit to the organization. So I think it's all about prioritizing what's at the best interest of our frontline personnel when it comes to duty of care.
Thank you, Zaman. And I think the same can be said for security. Paul, I see you jumping in. Go for it.
Yeah, and definitely completely agree. I would say that duty of care is non-negotiable. It's something that we don't balance. It's there, and we cannot ignore it. Non-negotiable. What we need to do, though, and what I think my colleagues online would agree, is accurate risk assessments and making sure that our partners, our staff, are aware of the risks, so that we're not asking them to do something and not making them aware. If unacceptable risks or an unacceptable level of risk is identified, then the duty of care takes priority, and that's it. End of story. Because at the end of the day, the duty of care, should there be a board of inquiry following an incident, and we failed in our duty of care, then I failed in my job, and my manager has failed in hers as well by allowing it to proceed. So, yeah, it's not a balancing act with duty of care. I would say it's there right at the top and should remain so.
Clues in the title, duty. And I think for all of us organizations, I think our biggest asset is our staff, right? So they're the ones that we've got to protect the most. I want to wrap up now and go to final reflections. Go ahead, Osman.
No, thank you so much. I mean, one of the things that we are trying to inculcate in each individual staff is the right to refuse. And if the staff members think that a decision has not been made at appropriate level, because this is within the framework of accountability. And if at, let's say, a field unit, when the available information indicate otherwise, somebody tells staff members to do A, B, C, D, or the staff members are to go into a place where it requires, let's say, availability of armored vehicles, but these assets are not available to them, and they know that once they get in there, they will be putting themselves at real danger. So the staff members have got the right to say at which appropriate level these decisions have been made. So from security risk management perspective, for us, we always ensure that the principle of risk ownership is maintained, that risk should be owned at always at appropriate level, so that a manager in pursuit of, let's say, mandate or program delivery does not make a hazard decision that put people at risk. But at the same time, the staff members must also know that they have got the right to question. I'm not saying people become renegade or something of the sort, but the staff members should be able to ask, what if, is this in place, is this in place, is this in place? And one of the things that we have made to make sure that the security plan is known to everyone. If everyone knows, what is the content and what's expected, what, in this bargain of I am here, what are you providing? If they know that what is on the side of the balance of the organization to provide, they have got the right to say, but under these circumstances, I'm supposed to be provided these in order to do A, B, C, D. If this is not in place, the staff member might say, no, You have not met your side, the right side of the bargain. So I'm not going to do ABCD. And we have seen quite this improve the quality of managers' decision itself, because they know that staff members will always question. So it goes back to information flow and if in staff members of being informed. Informed staff members are the best asset you can have in an organization. Thank you.
Absolutely. And that's a perfect point to kind of close the conversation on informed consent of staff in high risk environments. So I think I'm going to go to each of you on my screen. One thing, if you could change to wrap up today, security, duty of care, staff welfare in a remote context or high risk context. If there's one thing about how we approach this, what would it be? I'm going to turn to who I see first on the screen. So Alan, over to you.
I have a feeling we're all going to say this, but it's budget, budget, budget. So security is an enabling activity and it actually needs to be able to do its job. So it needs staff, it needs a budget, and organizations need to respect that before they go into these areas. It's me.
Wonderful. What about you, Paul? Final thoughts?
Yeah, take Alan's point, but I would go back to something I mentioned earlier, security mainstreaming, that the security are involved with the organization and a consideration at the outset of planning anything, but budget as well.
Osman, over to you. I think you're muted, Osman.
I think the top of the chart for me is the manager. So long that managers have not conceptualized the importance of security within programming, it becomes very hard. So it should be like what maybe some organization like where we work in the UNHCR have done to create a kind of the number of managers nowadays understanding that within the framework of accountability that they must first and foremost mainstream the security and programming has become now, has made it very easier for us. So maybe if I may just add about cross-border and cross-line, contingency planning should not be an afterthought. It should be embedded within every activity because no activity will go without some friction. So unless you have contingency plan in place, then the staff members, when they are outside your reach, they may not be able to function well.
Thank you, Osman. And I think that lends us well to the discussion we had earlier on planning. G, natural segue here. Any thoughts from your side?
I guess I would like to see more inclusion and capacity building of national partners and local partners within these frameworks, and actually just to more inclusion into the ecosystem. And just as a little cheat on the side, what Alan was saying about budgets, I would say donors need to be aware of what needs to be paid for within a project or a program of work. I know they want the bang for their buck, but ultimately there is a cost element every time teams or local actors have to deploy and work. And I think they should factor that in and not be naive to it.
Yeah, it is the cost of doing business in high-risk environments. Zaman, any last thoughts?
I think what I would change is the way the organization and the donors view stress and staff counselors. And that would definitely automatically lead to increased budget, right? We need to understand that the staff and stress counselors, they don't only provide counseling services, but beyond that, they add a lot of value and benefit to the UN. Beyond provision of these services, they do advocacy, they bring people together, they collaborate with security, HR, ethics, management, etc., to ensure delivery of the services. It is important that we all view counselors not through the only lens of therapists, but from a more holistic lens where they are viewed as advisors to the organizations to ensure that the workplace and the UN workforce are healthier. So I would change that view, and hopefully that change of view among the organizations and the donors will lead to the increased budget for the service.
Thank you, Zaman. And Ramon, any last thoughts from your side?
I'm happy I'm last here. because I liked Zaman's suggestion. As for me, well-being is part of operational readiness, right? It translates into effectiveness and efficiency. And I also liked G's suggestion because he talks in what I think he's speaking about empowerment, right, as a very important tool and a very, I think, cost-effective security risk management strategy overall. But I would say special thanks to Alan, Paul, and Osman, because what they are talking about, in my view, is that we need to ensure we enable the enabler, right? So the biggest change I would make is to properly mainstream security into programs instead of treating it as an overhead, an administrative cost, or sometimes even a constraint. Security should be seen as a core operational requirement, funded, planned, and owned as part of delivering responsibility in a high-risk environment. In other words, putting into practice the principle that there are no programs without security and no security without sufficient and sustainable funding. Over to you.
Thank you, Ramon. And I think that's a perfect place to end today's conversation on frontline and high-risk environments. And I'd like to really thank the panelists that have joined us today, particularly those calling in from far and wide. Colleagues, thanks for the Q&A. It's been great to have this conversation, and please do get in touch with us or the panelists if you'd like to talk more on this. So thank you, everyone, and have a lovely rest of the afternoon or evening wherever you are. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank
Okay,
you.
bye.
Thank you.
Bye.